Does anybody else feel like no matter how hard you try, you find it almost impossible to find a way of effectively managing your time? And as a result of this, you end up feeling overwhelmed, burnt out, and feeling like your days are full of those little tasks that don't actually give you any happiness and aren't actually making you productive. Let me let you into a secret. I felt this exact same way too, until I started to manage my time with this little grid I call a crash grid. I can promise you that if you learn how to use the crash grid effectively, you'll not have any of these feelings of overwhelm because you'll finally learn a system of how to manage your time that works for you. In this video, I'm going to give you the full tutorial of how to start crash gridding. So as always, the timestamps are on screen and they're down below in the description, but that's enough hanging around and let's get right into the video. To understand why you're feeling so burnt out and why you're trapped in this cycle of overwhelm, we need to understand how motivation actually works. So I want to imagine that you've got an essay to write and the deadline to complete it and turn it in by is in a couple of weeks. The thing is, in those early moments, you'll find any excuse not to do the work. So you put it off and you'll go hang out with your friends, you'll procrastinate and maybe scroll through social media, or you'll start working on the essay, but in a way that you know is just not productive and not a good use of your time. But all of a sudden, the deadline is in a few hours and you've got nothing to show for the past almost 2 weeks of time. So whilst you get it done just in time, you end up feeling overwhelmed and tired. And more importantly, it's not your best work because you've done it in a matter of hours. So if this sounds familiar and this sounds a little bit like you, I need you to listen very closely because this story perfectly exemplifies how motivation actually works. And that is, we need an incentive to do things. And oftentimes these incentives usually revolve around time and ideas of deadlines. Sort of urgency, that kind of thing. So because the incentive is tied so closely with this idea of time, the closer you get to the deadline, the stronger the incentive gets and the more likely you are to find the motivation to do whatever task you've been putting off. But the biggest problem and the mistake that 99% of people are making is not appreciating that oftentimes the most important tasks we have to do are things that aren't urgent. And if we can't find the motivation to do these things because there's no incentive, well, that puts us in a very, very bad situation. And you're going to be on a fast track to feeling burnt out. So if you take a look at the crash grid, you can see how we can kind of show this visually. You'll see in this grid how we can identify 4 different types of tasks. And basically it revolves around whether a task is urgent, non-urgent, important, or unimportant. But essentially, when a task moves from being non-urgent into being urgent, that's when we have more motivation and we find ourselves doing it. But the issue with things on this side of the grid is that this is how we feel burnout, this is how we feel stressed, and this is how we feel sort of overwhelmed when we feel like we can't control and we don't have that balance in our lives. So the thing is, motivation is more to do with time rather than the task itself. You could have the most important task to do in the world, but if it's not urgent and you're a beginner at time management, then you're not going to get it done until it becomes urgent. How do we solve this problem? And how do we find that motivation and discipline to do things way in advance? To understand this, we need to appreciate that there are 2 crucial laws of time management. And once you finally grasp your head around these laws, everything else will fall into place and your life will be so much easier. I want you to think about a time when your friend has asked you to do something. Maybe that's just going for a run, going for a coffee, going for a walk in the park. It can literally be anything. But then you look at your day, maybe you've got a calendar or maybe you've got some to-do list, some sort of time management technique, and you say that you don't have time. Then at 3 p.m., which is the time you said you wouldn't possibly have any space, any time to see your friend, you look at your watch and you realize you've been scrolling Instagram for the past 45 minutes. So the thing is, you did have time to see your friend, you just chose to spend it differently. And this brings us on to law number 1 about time management, that our time is ours to spend exactly how we like. If you really wanted to do something, it's not that you didn't have the time to do it, it's just that you didn't make the time. But there's another problem too, and once you understand it, you'll understand the second law of how to manage your time better. So the reason why loads of us feel so burnt out is that we put too much on our plate. And when you have so many different things that you're doing in your life, it becomes really hard to see what's actually important and what is less so. It's like you're trying to complete a puzzle, but you're missing pieces to it, or you've got extra pieces in the puzzle that have been added. How on earth are you gonna end up with a finished product? And it's this focusing on too many things that what's keeping you busy is keeping you unfulfilled, unmotivated, and in this cycle of burnout that I keep referring to. So law 2 of time management is to actually focus on the right things. But how do we use the crash grid to find out what these right things actually are and how we should be spending our time? So what you need to understand is that most of the things we've been talking about that lead to you feeling burnt out occupy space number 3. They're urgent, but they're not important. I can't be the only person who does this, but does anybody else have their notifications on for their email? Unfortunately, that means that whatever device I'm on, every time I get an email sent to me, I get reminded of this kind of pressing need to respond. Now, it doesn't matter who sent me the email, but for some reason, whenever I get this kind of notification, I feel like I have to respond in that moment. And this is a perfect example of those types of tasks that occupy box number 3. And I can guarantee that if you just go through your day and track down every sort of thing you think is keeping you productive and making, contributing towards your life, loads and loads and loads of these tasks go into box number 3. But here's the kicker, folks. Just because you're busy does not mean you're productive. And the key thing you need to do is stop as many of these tasks in box 3 as possible. And instead, you want to focus on that top right corner, box number 2. Now, box number 2 are things like socializing with your friends to maintain your relationships, going to the gym to kind of maintain your health, journaling to maintain your kind of mental health, all things of that nature, things that aren't super urgent but are important in the long term. Now, the more focus you can put on activities here, the easier it becomes to devote more and more time towards them. So initially, whilst you might struggle with doing the essay, for example, really far in advance, the more activities that you can do in box 2 make it easier over time for you to add more to it. And whilst I appreciate we're always going to have activities in that first box, the more balance we can find between the non-urgent tasks and the urgent tasks that are important, the better it is for our mental health and the less likely we are to feel burnt out. You might still be wondering how on earth you take action on some of those tasks, either in box 1 or box 2. Now, the easiest way to do this is by doing a did-do list. Now, to understand exactly what that is and the easy way to get started, you're going to need to watch this video. So I'll see you there.